The autumn breeze rustled through the trees on State University's sprawling campus as Michael walked toward the science building, his backpack heavy with textbooks and dreams. As a senior pre-med student with an impressive 3.9 GPA, he'd spent the past 3 years proving himself in every class, every lab, and every extra credit assignment that came his way. Being one of the few black students in the pre-med program wasn't always easy, but Michael had learned to navigate the challenges with grace and determination. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Education is the one thing nobody can take away from you. Those words had carried him through countless late nights studying, numerous part-time jobs to help pay tuition, and the occasional moments of doubt that crept in when things got tough. The science building stood before him, its modern glass facade reflecting the morning sun. This semester would be different, he could feel it. Advanced biochemistry with Professor Wilson was the last major requirement standing between him and his medical school applications. Michael had heard whispers about the professor from other students, but he believed in giving everyone a fair chance. As he walked into the lecture hall, Michael noticed how the other students clustered together, leaving subtle gaps in the seating arrangement. It was something he'd grown used to over the years, but it didn't bother him anymore. He chose a seat in the second row, perfectly positioned to see the board and take detailed notes. The classroom slowly filled with the nervous energy of first-day jitters. Michael pulled out his new notebook, the pages crisp and ready for the semester ahead. He'd spent the summer interning at the university hospital, and his understanding of biochemical processes had only grown stronger. This class would be his chance to shine, to prove that he belonged in the competitive world of medicine. Professor Wilson entered the room exactly at 9 a.m., his polished shoes clicking against the floor with each deliberate step. The professor's steel-gray hair and pressed blazer gave him an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. As he began taking attendance, Michael noticed how the professor's eyes lingered a fraction longer on him than on other students. When Michael raised his hand and confidently answered a question about enzyme kinetics during the lecture, he caught a flicker of something in Professor Wilson's expression. Surprise, perhaps? Or was it something else? The professor's response was curt. Adequate answer, but let's hear from someone else. Despite the professor's dismissive tone, Michael remained undeterred. He'd encountered skepticism before and had always let his work speak for itself. During the class breakout session, he found himself partnered with Lisa, a bright student who shared his passion for research. As they discussed their summer experiences and hopes for the semester, Michael felt a growing sense of optimism. "I've never seen anyone so organized," Lisa commented, glancing at Michael's detailed study schedule. "You really have everything planned out, don't you?" Michael smiled, explaining how he'd developed his study systems over the years. "When you're working part-time and taking a full course load, you learn to make every minute count," he said, sharing a brief glimpse into his daily juggling act between academics, work, and his role as president of the Future Medical Professionals Association. As the class wrapped up, Professor Wilson announced their first major assignment, a research paper that would count for 30% of their final grade. Michael's heart raced with excitement. This was his chance to demonstrate his capabilities. He'd already been thinking about exploring the cutting-edge developments in enzymatic therapy for genetic disorders, a topic that combined his interests in biochemistry and clinical applications. Walking out of class, Michael pulled up his phone to call his younger sister, who was starting her first year of college across the country. "Hey sis," he said warmly, "how's your first day going?" As he listened to her nervous excitement, he remembered his own first day 3 years ago, how far he'd come, and how close he was to achieving his dreams. That evening, as Michael sat in the library outlining his research paper, he felt a mix of determination and hope. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as he immersed himself in journal articles and research papers. Other students came and went, but he remained focused, driven by the knowledge that every hour of work brought him closer to his goals. Looking out the library window at the campus below, Michael reflected on his journey. Every challenge had made him stronger, every setback more resilient. This class would be no different. He had earned his place here through hard work and dedication, and no one could take that away from him. As he packed up his books to head home, Michael's phone lit up with a message from his mom. "Proud of you, baby. Keep shining." He smiled, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead this semester, he had a strong support system behind him and an unwavering belief in himself. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove himself, and he was ready for whatever came his way. 2 weeks into the semester, Michael began noticing subtle patterns in Professor Wilson's behavior that made his stomach knot with uncertainty. At first, there were small things, the way the professor would cut him off mid-sentence during class discussions, or how his raised hand would go unnoticed while other students were called on immediately. During one particularly memorable lab session, Michael had carefully prepared his enzyme analysis, triple-checking each step of the procedure. As he recorded his observations, Professor Wilson circled the room, stopping at each student's station. When he reached Michael's workspace, his demeanor changed noticeably. "Your solution appears cloudy," Professor Wilson remarked, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Are you certain you followed the protocol correctly?" His tone carried a hint of condescension that made Michael's ears burn. "Yes, sir," Michael responded calmly, pulling out his meticulously detailed lab notebook. "I can walk you through each step I took." But the professor had already moved on to the next station, where he praised another student's identical-looking solution as exemplary work. Lisa, who worked at the station next to Michael's, furrowed her brow in confusion. During their break, she approached him quietly. "I don't understand what happened back there," she said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Your work was perfect. I know because I followed your example for the timing of the enzyme addition." Michael appreciated her concern, but tried to keep things professional. "Sometimes people see what they expect to see," he replied, focusing on cleaning his workspace. Years of experience had taught him how to navigate these situations with dignity. The pattern continued in subsequent classes. During group presentations, Professor Wilson would frequently interrupt Michael's explanations with unnecessary clarifications, something he rarely did with other students. When Michael shared insights from his hospital internship experience, the professor dismissed them as anecdotal while praising similar contributions from others. One morning, Michael arrived early to set up for his group's presentation on protein synthesis. He had spent hours creating detailed slides and rehearsing his delivery. As other students filed in, he noticed Professor Wilson watching him with an unreadable expression. "Remember," the professor announced to the class, "this presentation requires a deep understanding of complex biochemical processes. It's not something one can simply memorize without true comprehension." His eyes lingered on Michael as he spoke, the implication clear to everyone in the room. Taking a deep breath, Michael began his presentation. His voice remained steady as he explained the intricate details of protein synthesis, drawing connections to real-world applications he'd observed during his internship. Some students nodded along, clearly engaged by his clear explanations and practical examples. But halfway through, Professor Wilson cut him off. "That's enough. We need to move on." Michael had only used half of his allocated time, while previous groups had been allowed to exceed theirs. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken understanding. After class, a few students approached Michael. "That wasn't fair," one whispered. "Your presentation was the best one today." Another added, "You explained it better than the textbook does." That evening, as Michael sat in the campus coffee shop reviewing his notes, he overheard 2 students from his class discussing the day's events. "Did you notice how Professor Wilson always—" Their voices dropped to whispers, but their concerned glances in his direction told him they'd noticed too. Michael pulled out his phone and began documenting everything that had happened so far in the semester. Dates, times, specific incidents, he recorded them all in detail. His father had always taught him to keep records when something didn't feel right, and now those lessons seemed more relevant than ever. Later that night, while working his shift at the campus library, Michael ran into Dr. Chen, his mentor from freshman biology. She immediately noticed something was off in his usually cheerful demeanor. "Everything okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "You seem preoccupied." Michael hesitated, then shared some of what had been happening in biochemistry class. Dr. Chen listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each example. "Document everything," she advised quietly. "And remember, you've earned your place here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Walking home under the campus streetlights, Michael thought about his younger sister, now facing her own college challenges across the country. He'd always told her to stand up for herself, to know her worth. Now he needed to live by those same words. Back in his apartment, Michael reviewed his class notes and assignments thus far. His work was solid. He knew that. The evidence of bias was becoming clearer with each passing day, but he needed to be strategic about how to address it. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Hey, a few of us are starting a study group for biochem. Would you join? We could really use your expertise." Michael smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope. While one professor might be working against him, he wasn't alone in this fight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities to prove his capabilities. Before turning out the lights, he added one final note to his documentation: stay focused on the goal. Medicine needs more doctors who understand what it's like to face barriers. Every challenge now is preparation for making a difference later. The research paper had consumed Michael's life for the past 3 weeks. Every free moment was spent in the library, surrounded by stacks of peer-reviewed journals and detailed notes. He'd chosen to explore recent breakthroughs in enzyme replacement therapy, incorporating insights from his summer hospital internship and the latest research publications. His regular study spot in the library's quiet corner had become like a second home. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, would sometimes bring him coffee during her evening rounds, worried about how late he stayed. "You're putting your heart into this one," she'd observed one night, noticing the careful organization of his research materials. Michael had asked 3 different professors to review his draft, including Dr. Chen, his freshman mentor. Each had provided glowing feedback and only minor suggestions for improvement. Even Lisa, known for her brutal honesty in peer reviews, had been impressed. "This is publication-worthy," she'd said, handing back his draft with detailed notes in the margins. The morning he submitted the paper, Michael felt confident. He'd gone above and beyond the requirements, including primary research data and even reaching out to leading researchers in the field for their perspectives. The paper represented everything he knew he was capable of: thorough research, clear analysis, and innovative thinking. 1 week later, Professor Wilson returned the graded papers to the class. Michael watched as other students received their grades, most nodding with satisfaction or showing mild disappointment with B's. When the professor reached Michael's desk, he placed the paper face down with a slight smirk that made Michael's heart sink. Michael waited until the class emptied before turning over his paper. The red F at the top felt like a physical blow. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, looking for explanations. The professor's comments were vague and contradictory. Lacks depth on one page, then unnecessarily verbose on another. No specific errors were marked, no clear justification for the failing grade. The room seemed to spin slightly as Michael read and reread the comments. This wasn't just unfair, it was deliberately cruel. 3 years of perfect grades, countless hours of research, and glowing recommendations from other professors all contradicted this assessment. That evening, Michael sat in his apartment, the failed paper spread out on his small kitchen table. His phone buzzed repeatedly with concerned messages from classmates who'd heard about the grade. He couldn't bring himself to respond yet. For the first time since starting college, he felt truly lost. His sister's call broke through his daze. "Hey, big brother, just checking in." Her cheerful voice made him realize he needed to pull himself together. He couldn't let her see him defeated, not when he'd always encouraged her to stay strong in the face of adversity. "Everything okay?" she asked, picking up on something in his voice. "You sound off." Michael took a deep breath and found himself telling her everything about the paper, the semester of subtle discrimination, the growing knot of frustration in his stomach. His sister listened quietly, then asked one simple question: "What will you tell me to do in this situation?" The question hit home. He'd always taught her to stand up for herself, to document everything, to know her rights. Now it was time to take his own advice. Late into the night, Michael began methodically building his case. He created a detailed timeline of every interaction with Professor Wilson, noting dates, times, and witnesses. He gathered his draft reviews from other professors, saved emails showing his research process, and compiled his source materials. Around midnight, his phone lit up with a message from Lisa. "Just heard about the grade. That's complete garbage. Half the class is talking about how unfair it is. What can we do to help?" Her message was followed by others from classmates, offering to speak up about what they'd witnessed throughout the semester. The support was overwhelming, but it also confirmed what Michael had suspected. Others had seen the pattern too. The next morning, Michael walked into Dr. Chen's office hours. She took one look at his face and closed her door for privacy. "Show me everything," she said simply, clearing space on her desk. For the next hour, they reviewed the paper, the grading, and the documentation of the semester's events. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned. "This isn't just about one paper," she said finally. "This is about accountability in academia. You're not the first student this has happened to, but you could help make sure you're one of the last." As Michael walked across campus afterward, his path forward became clear. He'd worked too hard, come too far to let one professor's prejudice derail his dreams of becoming a doctor. This wasn't just about his grade anymore, it was about every student who'd ever faced discrimination in silence. That evening, he began drafting a formal letter to the department chair. His hands were steady now, his purpose clear. The letter was respectful but firm, backed by evidence and supported by witnesses willing to speak up. As he wrote, he thought about his mother's words about education being something no one could take away. She was right, but sometimes you had to fight to protect it. Before sending the letter, Michael read it one last time. This would change everything, he knew. But sometimes change was necessary, even when it was uncomfortable. He thought about future students who might sit in Professor Wilson's class, feeling the same confusion and hurt he had felt. They deserved better. Everyone deserved better. The morning after sending his letter to the department chair, Michael woke up to an unexpected flood of support. His phone was filled with messages from classmates who'd somehow heard about his formal complaint. What surprised him most wasn't just their willingness to help, but their relief that someone had finally spoken up. Lisa had organized a study group meeting, but everyone knew it was really about something bigger. They gathered in a quiet corner of the student center, away from curious ears. 10 students showed up, each with their own stories to share. Remember when he dismissed Michael's presentation on protein synthesis? One student said, pulling out his class notes, "I wrote down exactly what happened because it felt so wrong. He let everyone else use their full time, but cut Michael off halfway through." Another student opened her laptop, showing a spreadsheet of grades. "I've been tracking our scores all semester. There's a clear pattern when you look at the numbers. It's not even subtle anymore." As they talked, more pieces of the puzzle came together. Someone remembered a conversation from last year about a talented pre-med student who'd suddenly switched majors after taking Professor Wilson's class. Another mentioned overhearing the professor making dismissive comments about lowering standards while looking in Michael's direction. Lisa, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked up. "My sister graduated 2 years ago." She said Professor Wilson had a reputation even then, but nobody had enough proof to do anything about it. The group spent hours organizing their evidence. They created a shared document, each contributing their observations, dates, and specific incidents. Michael watched in amazement as the document grew, telling a story much bigger than his failed paper. That evening, while working his library shift, Michael got an unexpected visit from Dr. Rodriguez, a retired professor who'd taught biochemistry before Professor Wilson. She'd heard about the situation from Dr. Chen. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, sitting down at the empty reference desk. "This has happened before." She pulled out an old notebook, its pages filled with careful observations from her last year's teaching. "I noticed patterns in his grading when we worked together, but I could never prove anything. The students who were affected, they usually just gave up and left." Michael carefully copied the relevant information from her notebook, adding another layer to their growing evidence. Dr. Rodriguez squeezed his shoulder before leaving. "Thank you for being brave enough to stand up," she said. "Sometimes that's all it takes, one person willing to speak the truth." The next day, Michael received an email that made his heart race. A former student who'd graduated 3 years ago wanted to talk. They'd met at a coffee shop off campus, where the alumnus shared his own story of struggling in Professor Wilson's class despite having excellent grades in every other course. "I almost quit medical school because of him," the former student admitted. "Made me doubt everything about myself. I wish I'd had the courage to do what you're doing." Back in his apartment, Michael organized all the evidence into clear categories: personal experiences, witness statements, grade comparisons, historical patterns, and faculty observations. He created a timeline showing how Professor Wilson's behavior had affected students over the years. His sister called during a study break. "How's it going?" she asked, concern in her voice. "It's bigger than I thought," Michael replied, looking at the stack of evidence on his desk. "Way bigger. You know what Mom would say, when you stand up for yourself, you stand up for everyone who comes after you." The next morning, Michael received an unexpected message from the department chair's assistant. They wanted to meet, not just with the chair, but with the Dean of Academic Affairs. The evidence he'd submitted had caught their attention. Lisa and 3 other students insisted on accompanying him to the meeting. "We're witnesses," Lisa said firmly. "They need to hear from all of us." As they walked to the administration building together, Michael felt a mix of emotions. There was anxiety, yes, but also hope. The weight of his failed paper had transformed into something more meaningful, a chance to create real change. The department chair's office was larger than Michael expected, with walls lined with academic awards and publications. As they entered, he noticed how the dean leaned forward, clearly interested in what they had to say. "We've reviewed your initial complaint," the chair began, "but we understand there's more to share." Michael opened his carefully organized folder of evidence. His hands were steady now, his voice clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student who'd ever faced unfair treatment in silence. "Yes," he replied, laying out the documented pattern of discrimination that stretched back years. "There's a lot more to share." The dean took notes as each student spoke, her expression growing more serious with each new piece of evidence. When they finished, she closed her notebook and looked at them directly. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said. "Sometimes it takes one person's courage to reveal a problem that's affected many. We'll be launching a formal investigation immediately." Walking out of the office, Michael felt lighter somehow. Lisa bumped his shoulder playfully. "See, sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing." That evening, as Michael updated his case file with notes from the meeting, he received an unexpected email. It was from another university, where a similar case had led to policy changes. They wanted to know more about how he'd gathered his evidence. "Maybe this is bigger than just our school," Lisa said when he showed her the email. "Maybe this is about changing how things work everywhere." Michael nodded, thinking about all the students who might benefit from what they were doing. Sometimes the hardest moments in life led to the most important changes. As he looked at the evidence they'd gathered, he knew they were creating a path for others to follow. The university campus buzzed with nervous energy as news of the investigation spread. Michael tried to maintain his normal routine, but he could feel eyes following him everywhere, some supportive, others questioning, and a few clearly hostile. In Professor Wilson's class, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The professor's demeanor had shifted from subtle discrimination to icy professionalism, every word carefully measured. Michael kept his head high, continued to participate in discussions, and maintained detailed notes of everything that happened. "You've started something big," Lisa whispered during Lat one day. "The graduate students are talking about similar experiences in other departments. People are finally speaking up." That afternoon, Michael received an email from the university's ethics committee requesting a formal meeting. His heart raced as he read the details. They wanted him to present his evidence directly to a panel of administrators and faculty members. Back in his apartment, Michael called his parents. His mother answered, her voice warm with concern. "How are you holding up, baby?" "It's getting real now," he admitted, sharing details about the upcoming meeting. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have just kept quiet, tried to pass the class another way." "Listen to me," his mother's voice grew firm. "Your father and I didn't raise you to back down from what's right. Remember when you were little and that teacher said you couldn't be in the advanced reading group? What did you do?" Michael smiled at the memory. "I showed up anyway and read every book on the list." "Exactly. You've never let anyone tell you what you can't do. Don't start now." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Dr. Chen helped him organize his presentation, making sure every claim was backed by solid evidence. Lisa and other classmates prepared their statements, each bringing a unique perspective to the larger pattern of discrimination. The morning of the hearing arrived crisp and clear. Michael chose his best suit, the one he bought for medical school interviews, and arrived early to set up. The hearing room was larger than he'd expected, with rows of seats facing a long table where the committee members would sit. People began filing in: faculty members, administrators, students, and even a few faces he didn't recognize. Professor Wilson arrived last, flanked by two people who looked like lawyers. The room fell silent as the committee members took their seats. The committee chair, a distinguished professor from the law school, began with a simple question: "Mr. Thompson, please tell us why we're here today." Taking a deep breath, Michael began his presentation. He spoke about his academic history, his dreams of becoming a doctor, and the systematic discrimination he'd faced. His voice grew stronger as he shared the evidence they'd gathered: the grading disparities, the witness statements, the historical patterns. "This isn't just about one failed paper," he explained, displaying charts showing grade distributions over multiple semesters. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has affected countless students." One by one, his classmates stood to share their observations. Lisa presented their statistical analysis, showing clear patterns in grading that couldn't be explained by academic performance alone. Former students spoke about similar experiences, their voices shaking but determined. Professor Wilson's lawyers tried to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, suggesting that Michael was simply struggling with the course material. But they couldn't explain away the numbers, the testimonies, or the documented pattern of behavior. During a break in the proceedings, Michael stepped into the hallway for air. A young student he didn't recognize approached him. "I've been following your case," she said quietly. "I'm a freshman and, well, knowing someone's willing to stand up like this, it makes a difference." Back inside, the questioning continued for hours. Committee members dug deep into the evidence, asking detailed questions about specific incidents and patterns. Michael answered each question clearly and professionally, even when Professor Wilson's lawyers tried to twist his words. Dr. Rodriguez, the retired professor, provided crucial testimony about historical patterns she'd observed. Her detailed records added weight to Michael's case, showing that these issues predated his time at the university. As the hearing drew to a close, the committee chair asked Michael if he had any final statements. Standing at the podium one last time, he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of supporters and skeptics alike. "This isn't just about me," he began. "It's about every student who's ever doubted themselves because someone in authority decided they didn't belong. It's about making sure education truly is something that can't be taken away from anyone." Outside the hearing room, Lisa hugged him tightly. "Whatever happens next, you did it. You stood up." That evening, Michael sat in his favorite spot in the library, trying to focus on studying for his other classes. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, brought him his usual coffee. "I heard about what happened today," she said softly. "You know, sometimes the bravest thing isn't starting the fight, it's seeing it through to the end." His phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "Mom told me what you did today. You're my hero, big brother. Always have been." Michael looked out the library window at the campus below, where students hurried between classes just like any other day. But something had changed. In standing up for himself, he'd given others permission to stand up too. Whatever the committee decided, that change couldn't be undone. The days following the hearing stretched into weeks as the university's investigation deepened. Michael tried to focus on his other classes, but it wasn't easy. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped, wondering if it was news from the committee. One rainy Tuesday morning, Dr. Chen called him into her office. Her expression was serious as she closed the door. "The investigation has uncovered something bigger than we expected," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "The committee gave me permission to share this with you." Inside the folder were printouts of emails spanning the last 20 years. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he read through them. Professor Wilson's prejudices were laid bare in his own words: comments about certain students not belonging in his program, discussions about maintaining traditional standards, and explicit references to finding ways to discourage minority students from pursuing medical careers. "There's more," Dr. Chen said quietly. "They found a pattern of grade changes with no academic justification, and they've identified at least 30 former students whose careers were directly impacted." That evening, sitting in his apartment, Michael couldn't shake the weight of what he'd learned. His phone lit up with a call from Lisa. "Have you heard?" she asked without preamble. "They're interviewing everyone who's taken his class in the past 5 years. This is huge." The investigation had sparked something unexpected across campus. Students from other departments began coming forward with their own stories of discrimination. The university's email servers were flooded with messages from alumni sharing experiences they'd kept quiet for years. During his library shift, Michael overheard two professors discussing the case. "It's not just about one professor anymore," one said. "This is making everyone look at how we handle bias in academia." The next morning, Michael received an email from someone he didn't expect, a successful surgeon who'd graduated 15 years ago. "I nearly quit medicine because of Professor Wilson," the email read. "I've never told anyone this story, but your courage has given me a voice." The investigation team set up interviews with former students who'd switched majors or left the university altogether. Their stories formed a heartbreaking pattern. Brilliant minds who'd been made to doubt themselves, dreams abandoned because one person decided they didn't belong. Lisa had been helping to compile data for the investigation. "Look at this," she said one day, showing Michael her laptop. "When you map out the grade distributions over 20 years, you can see exactly when he started targeting certain students. It's like watching discrimination happen in real time." The university brought in external experts to review the evidence. One afternoon, Michael was called to meet with them. The lead investigator, a renowned expert in educational equity, had tears in her eyes as she reviewed the stories they'd collected. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said, looking up from her notes. "For every student who came forward, there are probably 10 more who stayed silent. This kind of discrimination creates ripples that affect generations." As word spread about the investigation's findings, support poured in from unexpected places. Other universities began reviewing their own policies. Medical schools started discussions about bias in admissions. What had started as one student's stand against unfair treatment had sparked a national conversation. One evening, while studying in the library, Michael was approached by a group of freshman pre-med students. "We just wanted to say thank you," one of them said. "Knowing this story, it makes us feel like we can really belong here." The investigation team worked methodically, interviewing witnesses, analyzing data, and documenting every finding. They discovered Professor Wilson had kept detailed records of his own bias, perhaps never expecting anyone would see them. His private notes revealed a deliberate strategy to discourage certain students from pursuing medical careers. Dr. Rodriguez's old records proved invaluable. She had documented subtle patterns of behavior that, when combined with the new evidence, painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination. Her careful observations from years ago were finally helping to bring truth to light. Late one night, Michael received a call from his mother. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "When you were little, I always told you education was something no one could take away. I never thought you'd have to fight so hard to prove it." The investigation's scope continued to expand. They'd found connections to admissions policies, scholarship distributions, and research opportunities. Professor Wilson's influence had reached far beyond his classroom, affecting students' entire academic careers. During a meeting with the committee, Michael learned that other faculty members had suspected problems over the years, but felt powerless to act. "Your case gave them the courage to speak up," the committee chair explained. "Sometimes it takes one person standing firm to show others they can stand too." Lisa organized a support group for students affected by similar experiences across different departments. "Your case showed us we're not alone," she told Michael. "That's maybe the most important thing that's come out of all this." As the investigation neared its conclusion, Michael sat in his favorite spot in the library, reflecting on everything that had happened. Mrs. Thompson brought him his usual coffee and sat down beside him. "You know," she said, "I've worked here for 30 years. Seen lots of students come and go. What you've done, it's changing things. Real change, the kind that lasts." That night, Michael called his sister. "How's it feel to be making history?" she asked teasingly. "Honestly," he replied, looking at the stack of investigation documents on his desk, "it feels like we're just getting started. This was never just about one professor or one university. It's about making sure everyone gets a fair chance to follow their dreams." The university's main hall was packed on the morning the investigation's findings were announced. Michael sat between Lisa and Dr. Chen, his heart pounding as the board of trustees filed into the room. The crowd fell silent as the board chairman approached the podium. After a thorough investigation, The chairman began, his voice firm. "We have found substantial evidence of systematic discrimination spanning 2 decades. He detailed the findings: manipulated grades, biased evaluations, and a pattern of behavior that had affected hundreds of students over the years. Professor Wilson's tenure was terminated immediately. But the university's response didn't stop there. They announced comprehensive reforms, mandatory bias training for all faculty, anonymous grading systems, and a new oversight committee to review grading patterns across all departments. Most importantly, they established a review process for students who might have been affected by Professor Wilson's discrimination over the years. We cannot undo the past, the chairman said, but we can work to right these wrongs." After the announcement, Michael's phone exploded with messages. Former students who'd left medicine because of Professor Wilson were crying tears of validation. Current students shared stories of relief and hope. His sister sent a simple text: "You did it, big brother. You really did it." The next week, Michael met with the independent review committee assigned to evaluate his biochemistry grade. They spent hours going through his work, comparing it with other students' papers and consulting with external experts. "Your research paper was exceptional," the committee had told him, shaking her head at the injustice. "The level of analysis and insight, this is graduate-level work." They changed his grade to an A, but Michael knew the real victory wasn't about one grade, it was about changing the system. News of the case spread beyond the university. Other institutions began examining their own policies. Medical schools reached out to learn more about implementing similar protections. Michael found himself being invited to speak at educational conferences about creating more inclusive academic environments. One morning, he received an unexpected email from a medical school he'd applied to. The admissions committee had heard about his role in the case. "Your commitment to justice and systemic change exemplifies the qualities we seek in future physicians," they wrote. "We would be honored to have you join our incoming class." Lisa organized a celebration dinner at their favorite campus restaurant. Students and faculty who'd supported the case filled the small space, sharing stories and hopes for the future. Dr. Chen raised a toast to standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it seems. During the dinner, a freshman pre-med student approached Michael. "Your case helped me find my voice," she said quietly. "Last week, when a professor made some questionable comments, our whole class spoke up. That wouldn't have happened before." The university implemented its new policies quickly. Anonymous grading became standard practice. Faculty underwent comprehensive bias training. A new mentorship program was established to support underrepresented students in STEM fields. Michael's mother visited campus for the first time since everything had happened. As they walked past the science building, she squeezed his hand. "You know what makes me proudest?" she said. "Not just that you stood up, but that you helped others stand up too." In his final weeks of senior year, Michael worked with the university to establish a student advocacy group. They created resources for identifying and reporting discrimination, developed peer support networks, and built bridges between students and administration. During graduation rehearsal, Lisa showed him something on her phone. Their case was being included in a textbook about ethics in education. "Look at that," she grinned. "You're officially part of the curriculum now." The day before graduation, Michael received a letter from one of Professor Wilson's first victims, now a successful researcher. 20 years ago, I left medicine because one person made me believe I didn't belong," they wrote. "Your courage has helped heal an old wound. Thank you for fighting the battle we couldn't." Graduation day dawned bright and clear. As Michael adjusted his cap and gown, his phone buzzed with a message from his sister, "Ready to change the world, Dr. Thompson." Walking across the stage to receive his diploma, Michael thought about all the future students who would never know his name, but would benefit from the changes he helped create. His grade in biochemistry was perfect now, but the real achievement was in the transformation he'd sparked. After the ceremony, surrounded by family and friends, Michael's father pulled him aside. "Son," he said, voice thick with emotion, "you didn't just earn a degree today. You helped make this university a better place for everyone who comes after you." That evening, at a quiet dinner with his family, Michael's mother asked about his plans for medical school. "I want to be the kind of doctor who helps change things," he said, "not just treating symptoms, but addressing the root causes of problems." As they drove home, passing the campus buildings glowing in the sunset, Michael reflected on everything that had happened. One person's courage had sparked a movement. One student's stand had led to institutional change. One voice had helped others find theirs. His sister's words from months ago echoed in his mind. Sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing. The journey had been difficult, but the impact would last for generations. In standing up for justice, he'd helped create a path for others to follow. Looking back at the university one last time, Michael smiled. His battle for fairness had transformed into something much bigger. A reminder that positive change was possible when people stood together against injustice. The story wasn't just about one student or one professor anymore. It was about the power of speaking up, standing firm, and fighting for what's right.